They developed as a very crowded, busy, in many ways attractive community.
There were nightclubs, there were lodges, there were churches, there was a black newspaper.
You take people, the heart and soul out of a community, you lose the community.
Overtown has been a beautiful and prosperous community in that it's not the fault that people live here. It's not some kind of absence of ability on our part that makes Overtown look like what it is now.
There's no respect for the history and the heritage and the culture and the preservation of Overtown.
Freight train, run so fast. Freight train, run so fast. Please don't tell what train I'm on. They won't know what route I'm gone. When I am dead and in my grave.
The force was Henry Flagler and the Florida East Coast Railroad, which came into Miami in 1896, and that was the beginning of the city of Miami's existence as a city. Overtown was established even before the city was founded. The Flagler Railroad Company had a policy of having the northwest quadrants of each of the new communities that evolved as the railroad came south along the coast. The northwest quadrants of those communities were set aside for the black workers on the railroad. That was so that the blacks who lived in Overtown could be close to work. They worked in the hotels and for white people, but far enough away to not be seen.
Overtown was an incredibly rich community. There were more black-owned businesses here in Overtown than anywhere else in the city of Miami. There was not just entertainment, but hotels that were owned and run by African Americans. This was the Mecca. This is where everyone came. As performers came to Miami that were drawn here to perform on the beach, they could not stay on the beach, and so they would come over to Overtown, and that's where the real parties happened. That's where a real sense of community existed for those performers, and there were lots of professionals here in Overtown. This was the place to be until the destruction through the development of I-95.
About 40% of them came initially from the Bahamas. The other 60% or so came from Georgia, mostly from Georgia, and Central and North Florida. These people came down after the horrendous freeze of 1894 that caused the expansion of agriculture into South Florida.
It was heavily Bahamian and with some Jamaicans and others. And then there were also a lot of folks, black folks who came from different parts of Florida and Georgia in that early community. In fact, Miami's West Indian population, a reference to the Caribbean and the Bahamas, was so large, according to the U.S. population census, that in 1920, Miami had the second largest West Indian population after New York City in the United States.
It was a totally segregated community. You could not be outside of Overtown if you were black after dark without a pass signed by a white person.
Miami was a typical Deep South community in terms of race, and the police were the guardians of the establishment. And in Overtown, as the population grew, there were serious attempts on the part of the people in Overtown to move beyond the original constraining perimeters. And the police again and again would restrain that, as would Miami's just white population.
Miami was a segregated southern town before the railroad came. But people tell me that after the railroad arrived, it was much worse. It was the railroad that herded the blacks into the northwest quadrants. It was the railroad that insisted that blacks should no longer go in the ocean to swim. Prior to 1896, blacks swam in the Atlantic Ocean here. The Flagler people stopped that. The Overtown community was highly segregated, severely oppressed by the police, as well as just any white person who chose to take on that role. But at the same time, it was a cultural center for Black Miami. It was where the heart of Black Miami beat. It was where entertainment took place.
You would see families, for one thing. We were one big neighborhood of families. And then you would see churches. And we went to the various churches in the neighborhood. And then you would see schools. And we all took pride in all of our institutions. So what you would see when I was growing up would be a community of people who knew each other, who respected each other, who loved each other, who helped each other, and were an integral part of each other.
You also have to look at the spiritual life as well of blacks in the community, because were it not for the black churches, certainly up through the 1960s, black economic progress would have been much slower, black political empowerment would have been slower evolving, and social justice would have been slower.
You've got the segregated community. Economically, it's not faring as well as the downtown white community, but it's very rich culturally and even economically. There was a lot of businessmen, small businessmen. And Second Avenue, which then was known as Avenue G, was also known as as Little Broadway, because there were so many entertainment palaces there.
We had nightclubs. We had the Sir John nightclub. We had the Mary Elizabeth, and they featured some of the well-known artists.
Well, the Harlem Square Club was certainly the hottest one. There was also the Zebra Lounge at the Mary Elizabeth Hotel.
A real popular place was the Mary Elizabeth Hotel, built by a physician, Dr. Sawyer, named for his daughter, Mary Elizabeth. That was a great hangout for blacks who came to the area. Even in later times, Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali was there. Malcolm X visited. Martin Luther King was a visitor.
Many of the well-known black performers performed in Miami. Down in Washington, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, the Ink Spots. Sam and Dave had their start in Miami. Little Richard was here, scandalous Little Richard, even in the 50s. The Temptations, they all came and performed in Miami. The problem was that these groups, before the 1960s, could not stay in hotels on the beach. So they would perform for white audiences, because they were brought in primarily to play the clubs on the beach. And then after they finished their sets on the beach, they would come to these clubs in Overtown and then play all night until the sun came up, for free, for nothing.
On 2nd at 8th, on the east side, was the Lyric Theater, which has been restored in 1915. Further down on that side was the Rockland Palace. On the other side was the home of Clyde Killens, who was the impresario for entertainment in the area. The very end of that culture comes with urban renewal and expressway construction. By the middle 1960s, it's gone.
The biggest link in the whole expressway plan is the North-South Expressway. On the map, it runs alongside of Northwest 6th Avenue. Right now, the major work on this link is concentrated in the area between 36th Street and 75th Street. Well, this is the road we've been waiting for, one that will eventually take us all the way from the end of the Sunshine State Parkway down to and through the central business area of Miami.
This pilot project is in the Central Negro District and will be the first concrete step taken towards the renewal of this area. The Commission approved a 106-acre urban renewal pilot project area, which will be developed with 1,250 units of low-rent public housing. This housing will be for the elderly and for large-size families.
It's rough, and it's bad, and it's looked terrible. The people in this area here not aware of what's happened to them and what's going to be happening to them. Games been played all over their heads, under the tables and over the tables. These people are going to move out of this area in a short period of time and have no place to go. Understand? I wonder why These people have not been notified to come to meetings and stuff and letting them know what's going to happen to them and the welfare of them.
It's a feeling of frustration at this point because they really don't know what will be happening in their future. All they know is that they are being moved out with no place to go because there isn't ample housing in this area at the present time.
Whatever plans the city and county have for the redevelopment or destruction of the so-called pit area, Goodbread Alley, or Central Negro District, hardly anyone here knows. But most of the people living here and owning businesses do feel threatened and suspicious of government's promise of more housing and better services. Most of all, the people feel defenseless and without much hope. This is C.T. Taylor, Channel 4 News, reporting from Goodbread Alley.
Things began to change when the government came up with this whole idea of urban renewal, and the expressway came through, and that was a part of the changing community. And I don't really know what they meant by urban renewal, because Overtown looks worse now than it did back then. What they did was they just about killed Overtown, because Overtown was a thriving community.
I-95 ran right over Overtown, elevated itself over Overtown, where if a person didn't really want to see any black people, you could ride the interstate, and if you didn't look down, you wouldn't see Overtown or anybody black. The interstate system displaced probably as many as 20,000 blacks out of Overtown, forcing them into Liberty City, making it a much more crowded ghetto, much more dangerous place. The expressway system took jobs, took homes, businesses, public space. It was a great rape of the black community, and it didn't have to happen.
These interstate highway projects began to happen around the country in major black cities where they would destroy the black city for an extension of an interstate highway. And so Overtown was one of those locations. In the 50s, they talked about 3 options of building the I-95 extension. One was over the ocean, a second was across the railroad track, and a third was further out west, closer to the Everglades. And they chose to come directly through Overtown. They sold it as, this is going to be some great opportunity, we're going to rebuild, revitalize your community.
But the business community, the Chamber of Commerce in particular, they wanted to be able to expand downtown to the west. That meant having the interstate come through farther to the west so that downtown could expand in that direction. But it also meant running right through Overtown. But that was the conscious choice that was made. At the time, it was seen as a good thing, slum clearance, removing blight. But the idea of removing blight involved the idea of moving people, too.
What seems to be happening, people seem to want to buy this land. Everybody is out to get a piece of Overtown so that they could be a part of the development.
I had people talk to me about urban renewal. I mean, old timers have been around for a while. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s. I thought urban renewal was a great thing. They brought in street lighting, sewer systems, widened sidewalks in urban areas, including in inner city areas. But people told me that urban renewal was a big part of the problem. That when they came in to put in sidewalks, they would take the major part of people's front yards to widen the street or to widen the sidewalk or to put in planters along the right-of-way. And people resented that. You had a front yard that might not have been more than 40 feet anyway, and then the state comes along and takes 20 feet of your front porch. I've seen houses where people step out of their front door and they're on the sidewalk because of urban renewal. So properties were taken, people were more limited in terms of their convenience and comfort of being at home in those areas that were impacted by urban renewal.
My father was a bishop in the Church of God of Prophecy, and that church was in the way of urban renewal. So they had to move. At that time, located on Northwest 17th Street and 5th Court. I was christened in that church. But it is now located at Northwest 1st Avenue and 46th Street. So it was an uprooting of the community.
After Overtown, we kept moving around. So it was never any place that we can just.
What happened to your old house?
They tore it down. It was a shotgun house. We rented it, but it was all of us together, all of us together. And so we was renting it, but they tore it down. Now it's not there.
Today, there's in some ways a renaissance going on in Overtown. There's a lot of new building projects on the drawing board, white-driven to a large degree, some black-driven projects. They're building a little complex around the Lyric Theater. There's talk of housing. The big question in the black community is, will it be affordable for our people? And that's always a question. So I think there's some significant improvements in Overtown after many years and decades of being just in the doldrums.
Do you think it's going to ultimately be a revitalization of Overtown, or will it be a gentrification?
I think probably more gentrification than revitalization. I frankly do. You talk about the Hilton putting something up in that area. I just can't imagine that's anything but gentrification at the price that it'll be renting things.
Urban renewal today is more like urban removal. What's happening in Overtown is that people are being removed from that community by economic forces and political forces beyond their control. I would predict that in 10 years, Overtown will be primarily Hispanic and white. I predict that in 20 years, if you walk down 3rd Avenue or 2nd Avenue, you'll have to look around for a black person. I predict that they will continue to build condos and upscale housing closer and closer to Overtown and eventually in Overtown itself. And these are not homes being built for people who live in Overtown. Some of these affordable housing developments have units that begin at $150,000. And not many black people in Overtown can afford to pay $150,000 for a home. So we can see that the new urban renewal amounts to a new way of removing blacks from the community because they simply will not be able to afford to live there.
About 5 years ago, Miami experienced an unprecedented building boom. There was amazing amounts of capital flowing into Miami, and in fact, Miami was known as the condo capital of the world. And ground zero for this boom was downtown Miami, otherwise known as Overtown. And we have seen the entire landscape of Miami change in just a matter of a couple years. Miami was scheduled to have 92,000 condos developed in just the course of 3 years. That has inflated the housing market and, more than anything, completely redrawn neighborhoods that have been historic communities for Miami, like Overtown. And unfortunately, there's very few options. There's very few places to go because that boom and that inflation has taken place in the entire surrounding metropolitan area.
The thing that is commonly called the building boom or the housing boom actually, I think, is a gentrification boom. And what has happened is you've had money, capital, go into areas that have very, very low rents or low costs for land or for buildings and things like that. And they've taken, the capital's come in and taken those properties and then built them up increased the value of it and then moved wealthier people into those areas. And that's fundamentally what gentrification is. So it has been fueled by speculation, but also has taken advantage of very low rates. So the way that has impacted Overtown is a very, very low income community. The average income in Overtown is under $15,000 per year. It's probably the poorest community in the state of Florida, definitely the poorest urban community in the state of Florida. So money has been able to come into Overtown, grab all kinds of land, build condos there for dirt cheap, essentially, and then sell the same land for the highest profit. And while in some ways people have talked about the benefit of gentrification or the benefit of fixing up buildings and making buildings more beautiful, making buildings taller and bigger and better, the fact is the human beings who live there in Overtown, the people who lived in Overtown for many, many years, are being forced out. And they had to endure the very, very difficult circumstances and the really poor conditions for many years in Overtown. And now that the conditions are getting better, they're not there to enjoy them. They're being forced out.
So, first we had a boom that basically made low-income families and low-income communities invisible. And now we're in the midst of a bust. And Miami has, of course, one of the worst bust situations in the country. We went up real high and we came down real low. And the levels of foreclosures that are taking place are unprecedented. What you don't hear is also the levels of evictions that are taking place and the pace at which they're taking place. And this is a huge problem in Overtown, as well as many of the historic African American communities in the city. And this is just the trickle-down effect of bad real estate and bad speculation practices that have made even the few remaining affordable housing developments, few remaining affordable housing apartments and homes almost a thing of the past. Those homeowners have no longer been able to keep those homes. Those landlords have no longer been able to keep those buildings. And so people are being purged from those buildings at alarming rates. Banks have in fact become landlords, and banks don't know how to take care of buildings, much less relate to residents. And so we've seen a worsening crisis.
Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami governments, the local governments, not only didn't do anything to alleviate the crisis, but in fact just the opposite. They were actively exacerbating the crisis and making it worse. So the housing crisis was severe. People did not have enough places to stay. The county was closing down public housing units instead of building more public housing units. And then in the summer of 2006, the Miami Herald came out with a series called The House of Lies, which detailed the way Miami-Dade County was taking money out of the pot of low-income and affordable housing, and they were stealing it. They were taking it and they were doing all kinds of other things with it, giving it to politically connected developers and doing all kinds of shenanigans with the money other than building housing for the people who need it. So there was a palpable feel of disgust and outrage in the community. So while some organizations and groups went back and said, well, we're going to go and try to convince the government to solve the problems that they were largely responsible for creating and maintaining in the first place, a smaller group of us got together and said, we really can't depend on the county or the city of Miami to solve these problems. We have to solve them on our own. So we got together, we organized, we engaged the community, and after several months of planning, on October 23rd, 2006, Take Back the Land went and seized control of a vacant lot on the corner of 62nd Street and Northwest 17th Avenue in the Liberty City section of Miami. There we erected shanties and built an entire shanty town. We housed 50 people or so at a time, and over 150 people altogether. And the Emoja Village Shantytown stood for 6 months, and we stood against the city and county officials who tried to shut us down, and we stood for the community. We represented the community's capacity to fight back against the housing crisis and to fight back against government inaction or action which worked against our own interests.
So the fight for communities like Overtown continues, especially in the height of the housing boom and the housing bust. There are severe dilapidated conditions in a lot of the private homes in the community. And so tenants in Overtown are joining hands with tenants in Liberty City, Wynwood, and Allapattah to form something called the Miami Renters Union. They are part of a national movement to take back communities that are fighting gentrification called the Right to the City. And currently there are tenant unions that are going on rent strikes in Overtown, as well as Liberty City and Wynwood and Allapattah, as a means of taking back control of their families and their communities and taking back control of the housing conditions here in Miami.
But we felt that the same principles and the same conditions which led us to take over that land in the first place remain valid right after that and remain valid today. So consequently, Take Back the Land has been identifying vacant government-owned and vacant foreclosed homes. And we've been entering the homes, cleaning up and moving families into those homes. So we are matching homeless people with peopleless homes. We've done several move-ins. We now have people living in these homes which would otherwise be vacant, sitting in our communities doing nothing while we have people out on the street.
We should come back now and say, you know, you owe us. You took our land and you gave us very little for it. And now you're coming, taking it again with gentrification. And so I think that the people really need to rise up in righteous indignation with what city government is permitting to happen in this community. Because with the plans that they have, the people who are living here, it's going to be another displacement. You know, we're going to relive the urban renewal times and the expressway times all over again.
If nothing else, we're a symbol of the fact that there is a fighting spirit in Overtown, and there are people who are here to defend this community and think it's still a community and still worth fighting for. Because when you go downtown and talk to the politicians, it's, you know, Overtown is dead, Overtown is finished, Overtown is a done deal, this is downtown now, this is Overton now. And they really see that this community should somehow belong to them and be entitled, you know, it's their community, they're entitled to this property. And we need to move away from the idea that Overtown is a bunch of property that someone can acquire. This is a neighborhood, and these are a community of people that cannot be acquired despite that kind of thinking.
The sod on the side of the expressway, I think it was probably like over 50 pallets of sod just going up the land grant. Believe it or not, it's nothing but rock under there. It's nothing but core rock all the way through. So in order to plant the trees, we had to pick, and it was crazy. We had to bring the dirt, we had to bring the grass, we had to we had to actually take the water up there because at that time we didn't have sprinklers, so it was hard work. The vegetables, when you could get them, yeah, they're pretty good. I done had some okra, some collard greens, and I was trying to get a taste of the watermelon, but never got a chance. So.
Where we're standing is the Overtown Community Garden, at least a part of it. We're growing vegetables here, fruits, decorative plants. What you're looking at used to be just 2 huge vacant lots owned by the city. We started planting here without asking permission. They probably would have said no. Now we have hundreds and hundreds of plants out here, and another 2 or 3 months, we will be producing a winter crop for the community. I think anytime you clean up a dirty lot, you get the trash and the needles and the bottles and all of that away from sight, and you replace that with green grass and trees and plants, I think it makes people feel better. It makes me feel better. I think it has a calming effect on people. And I think the transition from vacant, trashy lot to a beautiful green space, for some people is inspiring. It shows that the earth rebounds even though we abuse it as badly as we do. Why is it important to know and remember what existed before? Because what existed before was terrible. It was horrible, and it was also beautiful and empowering. And that was what happened to us here. And if we forget that, then we can be victimized again, and we can forget and lose a lot of the beauty that came along with being a part of the growth of this community. It cut both ways.